Part of behavioral psychology. First article. Autoerotic death. Glossary. Autoerotic asphyxia. The deliberate induction of hypoxia with the intent of causing heightened sexual arousal. Autoerotic behavior. Sexual self-stimulation that can involve a device, apparatus, porno, prop, chemical or behavior that is engaged to enhance sexual stimulation. Autoerotic death. When autoerotic behavior is the cause of the death. Crime scene investigation. Crime scene investigation includes the crime scene examination and documentation, laboratory analysis of physical evidence, scientific interpretation of results, and scientific reconstruction. Hypoxia, partial oxygen deprivation, oxygen deficiency as opposed to total oxygen deprivation. Masochism, sexual arousal from punishment, bondage, discipline, humiliation, or servitude. Psychological autopsy, the process that death investigators and mental health experts use in collaboration to determine the state of mind of a person before they die. Article on autoerotic death by B.E. Turvey. Sexual fatalities or deaths that occur as the result of and in association with sexual activity. They include deaths that occur during consensual sexual behavior, death that occur during criminal sexual homicide, and accidental death that occur as a result of autoerotic behavior. In order to serve justice, it is important that crime scene investigators have the tools to discriminate between such cases, to avoid misinterpreting consensual sexual activity as a criminal act or an accident as an intentional suicide. Autoerotic asphyxia is the deliberate induction of hypoxia, that is partial oxygen deprivation, with the intent of causing heightened sexual arousal. An autoerotic death occurs during autoerotic behavior in which a device, apparatus, prop, chemical or behavior that is engaged to enhance sexual stimulation causes death. Conservative estimates suggest that between 500 and 1000 autoerotic fatalities occur each year in US alone. However, given the potential for misidentification, the true number is likely to be higher. Next literature heading. In 1983, Hazelwood and Dyer's study of 157 cases of suspected autoerotic fatalities gave the following breakdown. 132, that is 84% asphyxial, that is typical. 18, that is 11.5% is atypical. 5, that is 3.2% asphyxial with a partner. And 2, that is 1.3% autoerotic suicide. Yuva, in a review of autoerotic asphyxial deaths in the United States, reports that the incidence of such deaths is increasing, when in fact it may be only that the reporting or identification of such death may be increasing. Most cases involve young males, but the age range is very large. 1991, Blanchard and Hucker's study of 117 male autoerotic deaths in Canada gave a range of 10 to 56 years with a mean of 26 years. A third of the men were under 19 years of age. In 1995, Behrendt and Modwig, reporting on 46 male autoerotic deaths in Denmark, gave an age range of 10 to 71 years with a mean of 31. 64% of men were younger than age 29. Another study reported that 31% of the adolescent hangings in a section of Minnesota from 1975 to 1985 were autoerotic asphyxial deaths. Since the time of these studies, the literature on autoerotic death has advanced little and has comprised primarily of case studies and vignettes. In 2006, Savagu and Reset published a 50-year retrospective study of these cases in literature from 1954 to 2004. They found that anecdotally, the most common method of autoerotic activity that led to death or asphyxia from hanging, ligature, plastic bag, chemical substances, or a combination. Furthermore, they found that atypical methods of autoerotic activity that lead to death can be regrouped into 5 general categories, that is electrocution, number 1, overdressing or body wrapping, number 2, foreign body insertion, number 3, atypical asphyxial method, that is chest compression, inverted or abdominal suspension or immersion, and 4, miscellaneous. Atypical cases were found to represent about 10.3% of all published cases. Savagu subsequently reviewed all autopsy cases performed at a single centralized forensic laboratory that covers an entire 7.5 million province population for autoerotic deaths over a 7-year period, 2000 to 2006. This study found that comparing this population to the data in the literature, it seems that incidence of autoerotic death may be no longer be valid. As for atypical cases, they may be more frequent than generally assumed. This study was not without limits, that is, does not account for misidentified cases. They may not be generalized in the United States owing to differences in culture and media coverage, but it points to the need for a more updated research in this area. The nature of autoerotic death heading. Autoerotic death scenes can be mistaken for either a homicide or a suicide. They are in fact largely accidental in nature. There are certainly some cases in which the victim intended to commit suicide by autoerotic means, but these cases have been few. When an autoerotic fatality is identified, it should be assumed accidental in manner unless there is strong evidence to the contrary. Furthermore, autoerotic fatalities are not the result of criminal behavior and should not be treated as crimes. Once a determination of autoerotic fatality is made, law enforcement may no longer be required to investigate the matter further. Sexual pleasure sought by individuals who engage in autoerotic activity is primarily achieved through a combination of physical and psychological stimulation. These sources are not exclusive of each other. For example, the behavior of masturbation is physically gratifying if the individual places a mirror so that they may observe themselves masturbating. Then this becomes psychologically gratifying as it fulfills a visual fantasy for foreign objects in the mouth, penis, vagina and rectum. Extreme restrictive bondage and use of electricity, use of fire of self-immolation and use of water self-immersion, and the use of dangerous toxins, drugs and chemicals. One example could be an individual who used a great deal of cocaine while watching a pornographic video and while masturbating died of a heart attack. Another example could be an individual who repeatedly inserted a large pointed carrot into their rectum, causing a bowel perforation that led to an infection and then death. Still another example could be an individual who attached electrodes to the anus while masturbating and died as a result of cardiac fibrillation. A final example could be an individual who repeatedly immersed himself or herself in bathtub water and then accidentally bumped the head and drowned. In that case, the determination of autoerotic aqua eroticism would be possible if there were evidence of masturbation at the time of death. And a diary written by the victim detailing the heights of sexual pleasure achieved during autoerotic behavior in the past. Next heading, death scene characteristics. The identification of an autoerotic death scene requires deliberate and informed crime scene investigation and reconstruction efforts. Crime scene investigation includes the crime scene examination and documentation, laboratory analysis of physical evidence, scientific interpretation of results, and scientific reconstruction efforts. Reconstruction refers simply to the determination of the actions and events surrounding the commission of a crime. With any death that occurs in association with sexual activity, it is important to establish the presence of key death scene characteristics before it can appropriately be classified as an autoerotic death. In doing so, death investigators can hope to differentiate autoerotic death scenes from other similar types of death scenes such as suicide and sexual homicide. The particular death scene characteristics discussed in this section are often ignored or overlooked entirely by investigators. The two main reasons for this are the general lack of knowledge about the nature of autoerotic behavior and the fact that autoerotic fatalities often share common death scene characteristics with both suicide and sexual homicide. There are typically 12 general behavioral characteristics that investigators can look for to help them identify autoerotic death scene. It is not necessary for all the behavioral characteristics listed to be present for a determination of autoerotic fatality. These 12 items are not used as absolute inflexible checklist. These behavioral characteristics instead are intended to be a guide that helps investigators identify various forms of autoerotic behavior within a crime scene. The search for these characteristics is the basis for questions that death investigators consider when determining whether or not an autoerotic fatality has occurred. 1. Location. In autoerotic death, the location is likely to be a secluded area with a reasonable expression of privacy. That is, locked bedroom, bathroom, basement, attic, garage, workshop, motel room or a wooded area. Next, body position. In asphyxial hanging deaths, the victim's body may be partially supported by a ground, or the victim may even appear to have simply been able to stand up to avoid strangulation. High risk elements. These are items that are brought into the autoerotic activity to enhance physical or psychological pleasure. They include anything that is potentially harmful or reduces judgment, such as drug, alcohol or weapon. These elements increase the risk of autoerotic death. Next, self-rescue mechanism. This is any provision that allows the victim to voluntarily stop the high-risk element's effect. That is, literature dealing with escape mechanism, a slip knot in a ligature around the victim's neck, the freedom to punch a hole in the plastic bag sealed over the victim's face, a remote safety button on a power hydraulic within or near the victim's reach, keys for locks, or the ability to simply stand up and avoid asphyxiation altogether. Bondage. This refers to the use of special materials or devices that are physically restrain the victim. Handcuff, leather harness, wrist manacle, elaborate ligature configuration. These items have psychological fantasy significance to the victim. The presence of these characteristics can lead to investigators to believe that a death was homicidal when it was not. In cases of autoerotic death, it is important to establish that the victim could have placed the restraints on himself or herself without assistance. Literature dealing with the bondage may be found at the scene, or investigation may reveal that such literature was available to the deceased. 6. Masochistic behavior. This refers to the inflicting psychological humiliation or a physical pain upon the sexual area of the body or other body parts. It is important to look not only for the indicators of current use but also for healed injuries suggesting a history of such behavior. When appropriate, that is, sadomasochistic literature, spreader bar between the ankles, genital restraints, ball gag, nipple clips, cross-dressing, suspension, etc. 7th. Clothing. The victim may be dressed in fetishistic attire or in one or more articles of female clothing. However, cross-dressing or fetishistic attire may be absent. Clothing is not always a useful indicator in case of autoerotic death. It is possible for victims to autoerotic fatalities to be fully dressed, nude, or in a state of partial undress. Protective measures. The victim often will not want injuries sustained during regularly occurring autoerotic behavior to be visible to others. Injuries may be inflicted only to areas that are covered by clothing. Our victims may place soft protective material between their skin and restraining devices or ligatures to prevent abrasion or bruising. Example, a towel may be placed around the victim's neck beneath a hanging ligature, or a wrist restraint may be placed over the victim's clothing. 9. Sexual paraphernalia and props. These are items found on or near the victim that assist in sexual fantasy, like vibrator, dildo, mirror, erotica, diaries, photo, film, female undergarment, method for recording the event, an audio tape recorder, video camera, etc. 10. Masturbatory activity. The absence of sperm or semen at the scene does not rule out autoerotic death. The victim may or may not have manually masturbating at the time of death. Evidence of masturbation strongly supports the determination of autoerotic death. However, and may be suggested by the presence of sperm or semen, tissues, towels or lubricant on hand and sexual areas, sexual devices may be present. 11. Evidence of prior autoerotic activity. This includes the evidence of behavior similar to that found at the scene that predates the fatality, permanently affixed protective padding, plastic bags with repaired escape holes, pornography from many different dates, a large collection of erotica, complex high-risk elements, very complex ligature configurations, complex escape mechanism, healed injuries, grooves worn in a beam from repeated ligature placement, homemade videotape of prior autoerotic activity, witness accounts of prior autoerotic behavior. However, the event could be the first and fatal time the individual attempted such behavior. Additionally, the practitioner may not be at the usual location when he or she practices the behavior. In this event, while the asphyxia is a repeated practice, the location would not indicate that. For example, the victim could be found hanging in a hotel where he or she happened to be staying. 12th. No apparent suicide intent. The victim had plans for future events. Example, victim made plans or to see close friends or to go on a trip in the near future. Absence of a suicide note is not necessarily an indication of autoerotic event. If one is present, it must be determined that it was written around the time of death and is not a prop or a part of a victim's masochistic fantasy. Other indicators that the victim did not commit suicide or that the victim had no history of depression, had recently paid monthly bills and had spoken to friends for looking forward to a specific event. While the prior is a list of a possible elements, the following death scene findings are necessary to determine that the death is due to autoerotic asphyxia. 1. There is an expectation of privacy. 2. There is no convincing evidence of suicidal intent. 3. There is no evidence of another actor or the scene. 4. There is an apparatus to induce hypoxia. 5. The apparatus includes an escape mechanism even if it is as simple as standing up. 6. The victim could have placed any bindings found. Confounding influences on death scene findings include the friends and family of the victim. When friends or family members discover a loved one who has died from autoerotic asphyxia, their first impulse may be to sanitize the scene. They may remove and dispose of embarrassing items like porno material, articles of female clothing, and sexual devices, and generally may act to preserve a loved one's dignity before notifying authorities. Male versus female practice. Heading. Historically, literature has reflected a belief that autoerotic asphyxia is an adolescent male activity and that female devotees of the practice are either extremely rare or non-existent. Several modern papers have alerted the forensic community to the fact that female autoerotic asphyxia is not as rare as believed and may be more problematic than male autoerotic asphyxia in sorting out the behavior from a sexual homicide or a suicide. Most recently, a 2006 study by Soigu and Rasset found that female deaths resulting from autoerotic practice represent 4.6% of published cases. Regardless of the number of known cases which may be underreported due to misidentification, the reality of female practice must be acknowledged and considered when developing case theory and reconstructing events. Autoerotic death scenes of male tend to be quite different from the autoerotic death scenes of females. In male and female cases alike, the occurrence of autoerotic behavior has been found to be both secretive and repetitive. It has been found, however, that male victims tend to use a far greater range of elaborate devices and props during autoerotic behavior. These props are often designed to cause real or simulated pain. There is also a greater occurrence of cross-dressing and use of pornographic material. Female victims, on the other hand, tend to be found naked, often using only a single device with no excessive or elaborate apparatus or props. It has been repeatedly suggested that these death scene differences may account for a high level of underreporting and or misbehaving of female autoerotic death. This is especially true when female victims of autoerotic fatalities are deeply involved with self-binding and or sadomasochistic behavior. This scenario can readily appear to investigators as a sexual homicide, perhaps the work of a sexual predator. Other factors that tend to influence the characteristics found in autoerotic death scene include the friends and family of the victim. When friends or family members discover a loved one who has been the victim of an autoerotic fatality, very often their first impulses is to clean up the scene. They remove and dispose of potentially embarrassing items like porno, articles of female clothing, and sexual device, and generally act to preserve their loved one's dignity before notifying authorities. This is not criminal behavior done with criminal intent and should not be treated as such. However, investigators must be aware that this type of intervention can and does happen, and they must anticipate dealing with it. Psychological autopsy. Heading. An important part of the medical legal investigation into a death that occurs in association with sexual activity is the performance of what is referred to as psychological autopsy. A psychological autopsy is a term that refers to the process that death investigators and mental health experts use in collaboration to determine the state of mind of a person before they died. The question that most commonly arises in cases involving a person who was alone at the time of death is whether or not the death was accidental or a suicide. It is believed that by making a very thorough examination of the victim's lifestyle and history victimology, a more accurate determination can be made as to whether a death was an accident or a suicide. The question is not always answerable, but is most certainly cannot be answered without detailed information about both the death scene and victim's history. There are three major areas of investigative consideration when performing a psychological autopsy, that is wound pattern analysis, victim state of mind, and victim mental health history. To evaluate wound patterns on the victim, a complete analysis is required. That means examining the injuries on the crime scene, in the environment that they were created in, and at the autopsy after they have been cleaned up, when possible. This also means at the very least making an examination of all documentation relating to the crime scene and the autopsy, like sketches, photos, videos, reports, and notes. Key questions that are asked of the wounds include whether or not there are hesitation marks, whether or not the deceased could have caused the injuries, where any weapon that were used were found, and the precise cause of death. To evaluate the victim's state of mind prior to death, a complete background study of the victim's history and personality, that is victimology, is required. This includes conducting extensive interviews of the victim's friends and family, including close personal friends and any current or past intimates. Death investigative tools look for any of the classic warning signs of the suicidal behavior. These warning signs include giving away possessions, sudden cheerfulness, or emotional calm after a prolonged depression. Speaking of life in the past tense, social isolation, extreme changes in regular habits or activities, recent stressful events, an accumulation of stressful events, or recent death of friends and or family. If there is suicide note, this should be analyzed and compared to a sample of the victim's handwriting by a question document examiner. If a note is not found, handwriting samples should be taken anyway in case a note is found later. If a note is determined to have originated from the victim, then the contents of the note may reveal the state of mind and possible motives for their behavior. To evaluate a victim's mental health history, a full and complete analysis must be made of their medical and mental health interaction. This means taking into account whether or not the victim was or had been under any professional care, whether or not they were on any medication, and whether or not they had attempted suicide in the past. These types of intensive background inquiries of the victim by law enforcement or medical legal death investigators are not routinely conducted in sexual fatalities of any type, including sexual homicide. As a result, many autoerotic deaths are unreported or mislabeled as homicidal, suicidal, or undetermined deaths until such time as every scene investigator is educated regarding the true nature and form of autoerotic death and the importance of reconstruction combined and victim history. The variety and frequency of autoerotic death will remain unknown. Article completed on autoerotic death.